Hello and welcome to the 14th Human Rights in Asia Conference. My name is Jan and I am an LLM student here at the International Human Rights Law at the University of Essex. I'm also part of the student organization committee for this year's Human Rights in Asia Conference. And it's my pleasure to be the moderator for today's event. Our theme for this conference is Indigenous Peoples, Contemporary Challenges and Victories, where we have gathered distinguished panelists from all over Asia to discuss Indigenous issues and celebrate the work that Indigenous activism has achieved in advancing their collective rights. Our agenda today as follows. First of all, we'll have an introduction from Dr. Andrew Fagan, who is the Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex. And then also with Dr. Sanai Fujita, who is the Supervisor and a Fellow at the Human Rights Center. Then we will move on to our speakers, who each will have 20 minutes, and with Dr. Mr. Phoolman Chaudhary, who is a member of the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples. And then moving on to Maitin Yumon, who is the Program Director for the Indigenous Peoples Development Program of the Chin Human Rights Organization. And then to Gladson Dungdung, who is the General Secretary of the Jharkhand Human Rights Movement. And then we will have a joint Q&A session at the end. And then the conference will be closed by Dr. Carlos Diego Gramenga. We will only have one housekeeping rules really, and that is to please use the Q&A function for your questions. Please do not use the chat function. Thank you very much. I will now pass the floor to Dr. Fagan and Dr. Fujita.
Jan, thank you. Thank you so much for getting us started. My name is Andrew Fagan. I'm Director of the Human Rights Centre. I've been at the University of Essex and the Human Rights Centre for a very long time, and therefore I can remember the very first time that we held this particular conference. This is now the 14th. So I hope that's a demonstration of the commitment of the Human Rights Centre and the wider university to engaging with this crucial issue. Asia is, as you know, the most populous region on Earth. It is a region with a great many, as most regions are, a great many human rights challenges, which sometimes are overlooked by the kind of global system, as it were. So we certainly wanted, when we first discussed, and Sanai was part of those discussions and has been a driving force behind this particular conference, we realized that there was an urgent need to address our attention, provide an opportunity for our students and our community to discuss and to engage with human rights challenges. And I'm pleased to see from the subtitle of this conference, successes too in the human rights field. Every year, the organizing committee led by Sanai, by Dr. Fujita, has identified a new topic, a topic which is topical and very deserving of our particular attention. And this year, the focus is upon Indigenous peoples. Again, I think many people tend to, when they hear Indigenous peoples, they perhaps tend to think of North America or parts of Latin America, Africa. They may not always actually think about Asia and connect Asia to Indigenous peoples' rights and rights claims, but they are urgent and extremely deserving of our time. So I'm delighted to be able to open this particular 14th staging of this event. Once again, it's online in a pre-COVID age. We used to have it in person in the university, which has its advantages and disadvantages. It can be a bit cold and dark sometimes in early March in Eastern England, to be honest with you. So here we are, we're online. I wanted to really acknowledge and to thank Sanai, Dr. Fujita, again, for all of the work that she has invested every single year in this particular and driving this particular conference. And just as importantly, the willingness and the passion and enthusiasm of our student team. This is a student-led or a student-run conference. It is demanding. Anyone who's had any involvement behind the scenes in putting together a conference will know that there's a great deal of work that needs to be done in order to enable this to happen. So again, huge respect. You want to do that. Huge respect and huge gratitude to Sanai and to the student team. I'm sure you're all going to have a really interesting 2 days, so this Saturday and next Saturday, and I look forward to seeing the results, the consequences. Sanai, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to you now. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew. This is my turn, and I'm glad to see you all this Saturday, maybe evening. This is just before noon, and then briefly from my side, I like to introduce this background of this important conference, and how it started. First of all, I really appreciate that the Human Rights Center always support this important event, and especially Human Rights Center event team and Dr. Fagan and all my colleagues who support this conference happens, and this all speakers from all over the world, and of course the student conference team. You did very good job. So I like to introduce briefly how this happened and how important it is. As Andrew said, that this is a student-led conference, and the former director candidate said this is a flagship event of the Essex Human Rights Center. So this is an annual official event now. And Asia is most populated region in the world. This area has more population than the other rest of the world. And still that the ratification, as you said, Asia region is not doing very good job compared to other regions. So we have so many problems and challenges in human rights. However, we don't have a particular module at Essex Human Rights course regarding Asia. So it's a bit disappointing for the student, especially from the Asia region. 2009, some MA and LLM students, especially from Asia, raised a voice, and they started a small study group, and we make it as a conference. This is our first conference in 2009. It's very short, but it's very cozy, nice, and it was not finished. So we continued as annual stuff. So by degree, it became more of a get more attention, a bit of a more participants from other side, as a place, not only Essex, and we student always pick up very timely good topic, and we invited very famous people like former president of Maldives, and so this each year student pick up very timely topic, and then unfortunately since 2020 we turned to the online event, but this is good and bad. So we have now more participants from all over the world, and this is this year's excellent student team. I've been so delighted to work with you, and it was very honored to work with you, and I just congratulate your hard work. So this is a 14th, and all participants and the attendees, please enjoy not only today, but we're going to have another one next Saturday. So don't forget to register. We have to do separate registration for next day. So that's all from me, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fagan and Dr. Fujita. Thank you as well for making sure that students have this opportunity to learn about human rights in Asia, and to get them really involved by making this conference. We will now move on to our speakers, whom we are very, very excited to have with us. And first of all, we will have Phoolman Chaudhary, who is the expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He hails from the Tharu Community, and he has served as a member of the steering committee of the Indigenous Peoples Forum at International Fund for Agricultural Development. And he was also an Indigenous Fellow with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. For 10 years, he held the position of a team leader with the Nepal National Social Welfare Association, and within the regional international level, he is associating as an executive president of the Asian Indigenous International Network. He is also a consultant advisor for the Unison for Peoples Alliance. For over 2 decades, he is one of the key activists of the Indigenous Peoples' rights in Asia region, including Nepal. I'll hand over them to you and Mr. Phoolman Chaudhary, and welcome to the conference.
Thank you very much, John Desena. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and namaste, whatever your time zone right now. Distinguished speakers, distinguished indigenous representative, leaders, fellow participants, distinguished entire team of University of Essex, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor and pleasure as being a speaker in this wonderful conference of 14th Annual Human Rights in Asia, with focusing particular theme, Indigenous Peoples, Contemporary Challenges and Victories. On behalf of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, I extend my sincere gratitude and warmest welcome all of you. As well, I would like to thanks to entire team of University of Essex, United Kingdom, as you provide me a great opportunity and space to address this precious conference with this digital platform. I believe this conference would be one of the essential action to come up with the Indigenous people's common vision for the advancement of rights of Indigenous people at all levels. Most importantly is that to enhance the access of Indigenous peoples to fully engagement with the forest, water, and land, which are first hand of the Indigenous people. Additionally, I would say this conference would be more fruitful for in preparation of the upcoming annual session of the UN Permanent Forum, which will take place in April 2022, UN headquarters, New York. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, if we look at the scenario of human rights, particularly of Indigenous peoples and local communities, we realize lots of challenging and obstacle that reflects to the Indigenous people around the world, including Asia region. So I take this opportunity to reflect some of the specific issue of the representative of Indigenous people that concern with all of you. Of course, Indigenous people and local communities are holders of the rights of self-determination to be consulted in matter affecting them, to their land, territories, and resources, and to maintain and develop their culture, traditions, beliefs, and spirituality in the first hand and universality and indivisibility of the all human rights are prosecuted to any policy that state adopt. Dear friends, I have briefly set out some viewpoints for kind consideration. Let's bring our commitments to the reality with priority in every step for the better environment for the Indigenous people around the world. I thank all of you for your kind patience and attention, and I look forward to close cooperation on common agenda, which are directly related to Indigenous people across the Asia. Of course, Asia is the largest continent of the earth. It serves as a home to more than 4.7 billion people out of 7.9 billion population in the world. Asia is also home to over 260 million indigenous peoples, or 70% of the world's indigenous population, out of the about 476.6 million indigenous people in the world, split in the 49 countries. Like China and India have the world's largest population with 1.4 billion and 1.39 billion people respectively. So more than 320 million people in Asia live in extreme poverty, which means hundreds of millions of people are living on less than $1.90 a day. This is the figure of, recognized by the World Bank. Implies the lack of food, shelter, clothing, sanitation, nutrition, education, transportation, and minimum health care. Over 380 million children and adults in Asia are not getting proper nutrition in their diets. 610 million people in South Asia still practice open defecation. This is the figure made by the UNICEF. So we indigenous people believes on collectiveness and solidarity. Indigenous people itself literally represents communal collectiveness. It is because our community has a self-governance and rules with our own collective decision and participatory decision of the whole community. The indigenous people and our priority of the respect is always the collective communal decision from the community. We respect and accept the decision of community, not of an individual. So I'm very keen to learn more about the modern theory of the like autonomy and self-governance in the context of the new era, which is slowly isolated and excluded by the original theory of human rights-based approach and the 2030 global agenda. So far, what I have learned about, understood about the human rights-based approach and the 2030 agenda, global agenda of the sustainable development are based on interests of the states and in industrial development, which are oriented to harm to biological diversity, fuel to climate change, agro-industries, economic and developmental aggregation, criminalization, and so on, which are obviously impacting to the indigenous people across Asia and the world. It is universal fact that there is a neo-colonization to indigenous people in the name of addressing indigenous people's issues, inclusion of indigenous peoples, participation of indigenous peoples, and intersectional group in the political sphere. What we are collectively have to be aware of and caution of is we must understand our region and our origin of autonomy and self-governance. As well, we must be less individualistic and self-centered for any political position. And economic benefits offered by the government and the industries because our communities are wider, not just an individual community or person. So moreover, I would like to take this opportunity to highlight some overview that are really connected and related with the indigenous people. We indigenous people are the creation of the soil which compose land, forests, and resources, full with the indigenous knowledge and wisdom. Our indigenous soil, forests, and resources are undefined and unmeasured by any sort of principle and values because our origin belongs to the origin of the nature. That means before origin of autonomy and self-governance. So autonomy and self-governance are imported words from the neo-development, which are insufficient to represent the value of principle of the indigenous people. It is just a development fiction introduced to rule over the indigenous people in the name of the nation and development. These days, when right-based conservation, biodiversity, climate change, theory of change, business and human rights, and all newly introduced and adapted theories, concept and principle are away from the origin of nature of autonomy and self-governance, because all those concept, theories, values, and principle are the blessing of conflict of interest in different name of development, inclusion, human rights, indigenous peoples' rights, intersectional rights, and so on. It is because the money for the development of all these fascinating and respectful insight are from the institution and the resources who are gazing at the soils of the indigenous peoples enriched with natural resources, biodiversity, and so on. While so pulling out all of these facts and truths, we also need to build up our cooperative and collective nature of perception of practice, because the universe and the Mother Earth is only one for all, not only for indigenous communities. And it is not only indigenous people who need to be worried and protective for the protection and conservation of the nature in the name of autonomy and self-governance. Rather, it is common responsibility of all of both indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, because if there are some natural disaster, starvation, climate crisis, environmental degradation, they will not only impact to the indigenous people, but to the entire group of peoples and the whole. So these message of autonomy and self-governance are not to only respect the indigenous peoples, traditional institution and practice of indigenous people. Rather, they are the respect to the womankind who are trying their best to protect the old and Mother Earth. So acknowledging the, respecting the universal fact for the indigenous people's rights, we may not just limit in the provision interpreted in UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, ILO Convention 169, and any national and international laws. We have to widen to meaning of the autonomy and self-governance based on our origin value, principle, practice, and context of the protection of the humankind and the whole. If the mistake of undermining is done to limit autonomy and self-governance for and with the indigenous communities, then that may alarm the devastating risks to the whole, which are the now facing as a pandemic COVID-19 since 2020. Hence, my humble request is to indigenous brothers and sisters and other stakeholders, including to the entire world. We are in the planet made of soil, water, and forest. If we try to be smarter and exploit our nature and Mother Earth, we may be pushed into more devastation. Nothing is smarter than nature. That's why indigenous people trust in autonomy and self-governance based on nature. So I'd like to highlight some international obligation, like we have a very fantastic and a very important international document like UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, and another one is the ILO Convention 169. Of course, we celebrate in 2017 year the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, which is declared in 13 September 2007. But it is a great milestone in the history as the government in the world have come together to recognize the rights of indigenous people and committed to implement the declaration. In this regard, the United Nations has been organizing the whole conference to build a collective action-oriented action plan with the inclusive approach to ensure indigenous peoples are given space to decide, participate, and contribute to the development. So just I would like to mention here about the declaration. Of course, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is the most comprehensive international instrument on the rights of indigenous people. It embodies global consensus on the rights of indigenous people and establishes a universal framework of minimum standard for their survival, dignity, and well-being. It is elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to specific situation of indigenous people. So the United Nations General Assembly has affirmed that indigenous people are equal to all other peoples while recognizing the rights of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, and to be respected such as. Although there has been a major progress globally in implementing the declaration over the last decade, there continuation to be a gap between the formal recognition of indigenous people and implementation of policies on the ground. As a result, indigenous people continue to face exclusion, marginalization, and major challenges in the enjoying their basic rights. This has the potential of the harming greatly the peace and the good governance in the areas inhabited by the indigenous people. Today, so much of progress is noticed in all fields across the world. It is important to give the attention to fact that indigenous people face the destructive impact of development agenda that is often led by capitalism. Indigenous people must be included at all levels of policy planning, implementation of sustaining efforts. They must be given the freedom to decide and design their development agenda, which is community-led and sustainable, that protect the environment. Largely development projects, especially the massive industries marginalization in the lens of the indigenous peoples lens, because displacement of often forcibly eviction, which has the serious human rights implication for the indigenous people. The lose of the land deprives the indigenous people of their livelihood, resources, religious places, culture, and the basic thread of their social life, community life. Finally, they end up the vicious cycle of the poverty as they were moved from the place to place as wage labor to the ensure both in submit. So the United Nations has another agenda which is recognized globally, that called the United Nations 2030 agenda for the sustainable development goal. It is clearly spell out the transformative and action-oriented plan of eradicating poverty and hunger in all forms of dimension. The declaration numbers of reads we resolve between now and 2030 to end the poverty and hunger everywhere, to build peaceful, just and inclusive society, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the environment of women and girls, and to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. This is a statement. It is clearly mentioned in the 2030 agenda. Of course, we have another action is adopted by the AIIN, is called High Level Political Forum, which is United Nations Economic and Social Council. Recently, last time we received a very useful document, is clearly mentioned on the document, eradicating poverty and promoting prosperity in a changing world. Thus, it can be seen that globally collective efforts and actionable steps have been identified for the member state to work on. Such common agenda is all governments to ensure that rights of indigenous people. So we have another international convention is called the ILO Convention 169. This is really important for the indigenous people. The ILO Convention 169 it clearly defines its Article 15, the rights of indigenous peoples concerned to natural resources pertaining to their lands shall be specifically safeguarded. These rights includes the rights of these peoples participate in the use, management, and conservation of these resources. So in this context, I would like to describe some few points more. The fast expansion of the cities and towns, coupled with the growing needs of the people, has put tremendous pressure on the natural resources, especially land, forest, and water bodies. The scheduled areas, basically, scheduled area is located in India, are also full of mineral resources. This attract massive investment in mining and setting up large industrial units. The powerful corporate sector backed by the government are setting up industries, and in addition to the land grabbing of indigenous people. It is being observed that the incident of the grabbing of indigenous people's land, it is confrontation with the various projects are increasing day by day across the Asia region. Forcibly displacement of the indigenous people from their native lands, forests are emerging as a serious concern for the indigenous people. In some cases, it is also observed that residents and protests are being suppressed. It is also observed that any raising of voice by any indigenous people is suppressed by the turning them like mice and put in the jail. This is a very serious case. It is also observed that they are subjected to ill treatment and atrocities are committed on women and girls. Incidents of the rapes of women are emerging. Tactics of instilling fear is being used to force indigenous people to give away their land. So the central feature of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and International Labour Organization Convention 169 on Indigenous People, Tribal Peoples in 1989 is recognition of the customary rights of indigenous people to lands, territories, and resources, as well as the restitution of the lands taken without their prior informed consent. In the conservation policy context, the Convention of Biological Diversity, adopted in 1992, primarily reflect the protection for the traditional knowledge, Article 8J, and the customary use of biological resources with the conservation requirement, Article 10C. So despite huge resources being allocated to the development of the indigenous people across the Asia, still a large number of them are living in poverty. There is a need for the strong political willing power and commitment to respect the provision of the constitution of Asian country. These are the main issues and concern from raised by the indigenous people. So finally, I would like to elaborate here. We have very prominent speaker, and they will explain about their concern related to the indigenous people's issue. But I would say this dialogue is a really good opportunity to develop with indigenous peoples to make a practical roadmap leading to stronger action to promote and protect the indigenous people's right at all levels. This can include personally, and I would say here, this dialogue can include to implement the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the further promotion of ILO Convention 169. This is the very good opportunity for us to make action on driving state in fulfilling their international human rights obligation. I finally would say I urge to all stakeholder and member state of the United Nations to work in full partnership with the indigenous people and their representative to take proper action for the indigenous peoples, promoting and protecting rights of indigenous people. This is my overview for this conference. If I have additional any views, I can add again. Now I want to finish my presentation here. Over to you, Jan Desena.
Thank you for that, Mr. Phoolman Chaudhary. That is a very, very interesting overview of indigenous rights. And I particularly like the part where you talk about being the importance of collectiveness and the community decisions surrounding indigenous peoples. And it's always very interesting to know what the international organizations are now doing more to advance the indigenous people's rights. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And now we're now going over to our next speakers, who is Maiti Newman. She is the Program Director for the Indigenous Peoples Development Program of the AIIN Human Rights Organization in Myanmar. She has also served as a member of the UN Global Indigenous Youth Caucus since 2016. And she is also a member of the Indigenous Peoples Forum at the International Fund for Agricultural Development. She represents youth to the Executive Council of Asia, Indigenous Peoples Pact, and as a AIIN human rights activist, She advocates for Indigenous peoples' rights at the national, regional, and international level. She is also particularly active in engaging with Indigenous youth and Indigenous women at the grassroots level in Myanmar. So let's all welcome her to our conference. And as remember, please put your questions on the Q&A chat and don't use the chat function. I will now hand over the floor to Mighty Newman.
Thank you, Jen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining from. It's first of all, let me say thank you to the organizers, and especially for choosing this topic. And it's an honor for me to be a part of this conference, sharing the experience of Indigenous youths and the work that we have done collectively at the global and regional level. So my presentation will take about 20 minutes, and I will use a PowerPoint so that you can be more engaged looking at the photos where we are in action. So allow me to share. Okay, so I would like to take you all to a glance at the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus and Indigenous Youths in Action. So Indigenous youths, like globally, the youths, when we talk about youths in Indigenous communities, it's not, we usually have age difference with the definition from the United Nations. And when we refer to Indigenous youths, we usually base on the role that they play on and the contributions that they make in the communities. So when I refer to Indigenous youths, it can be youths from an early age, like 12, 13 years to 35 to 40 years in some communities. On average, it's mainly between 15 and 35 when I refer to Indigenous youths. So we Indigenous youths form quite a large population in Indigenous communities, and we are a part of the Indigenous rights movement for the protection and promotion of the rights of Indigenous peoples, because we are also not only the future, because usually we refer to youths as the leaders of the future, but in Indigenous communities, we have this really strong practice of intergenerational cooperation, in not only in terms of like education, early education, but mainly in the sustainable management of land and natural resources that we have, in the preservation and in the practice of the protection and practice of our culture and traditional norms, and preserving our Indigenous languages. So we play, as Indigenous youths, we play a very big role in our communities, and there are a number of contributions that we make. Not only from the perspective of Indigenous knowledge, but also we are the bridge that can create and that can build a strong connection between the Indigenous traditional values, practices, norms, and the modern technology that is leading in the world's arena today. So today I would like to take you through the movement that Indigenous youths, how we have been a part of the Indigenous people's rights movement at the global level and regional level, and also take you through the challenges that we're facing, and then the progress that we've been also making throughout the past few decades. So first of all, I would like to introduce the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, GIYC. The Global Indigenous Youth Caucus is a working Caucus, which meets yearly alongside the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. As most of you might be aware already, starting in 2002, the UN Permanent Forum happens every year at the UN headquarters in New York, inviting with indigenous peoples and different UN agencies, and where the most of like indigenous representatives from around the world, up to 2,000 participants, attend and discuss issues for 2 weeks, present the issues that indigenous communities are facing and the recommendations to different UN agencies, to member states, and also to the INGOs, NGOs, and relevant stakeholders. So the UN Permanent Forum is the biggest forum of indigenous peoples, where you can hear all the you can meet indigenous peoples from different parts of the globe, and you can also hear all the issues that different indigenous communities are facing. And that's where the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus also joins as a working caucus. And then and also we try to voice our issues that we discuss alongside the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So our structure is very simple. We have 3 co-chairs and 2 focal persons from 7 social cultural regions of the indigenous peoples. So if you are not aware about the 7 social cultural regions of the indigenous peoples, it's Africa, Asia, Africa, Asia, North America, Central America, South Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Central Europe, and Transcaucasia, and the Pacific. So we have these 7 social cultural regions, which is different from the 5 regions of the world. So we have altogether, we have 15 members of the UN Permanent, the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. And this is just a photo record from 2016, where we were presenting our issues. This is like 7 years ago, really, when we were really like young and new at the UN, at the GIYC. So how did the GIYC begin? So like I mentioned, in 2002, the first session of the UN Permanent Forum was conducted, and then young indigenous participants were there, and quite a big number of young, not very big, but a few from each region were there, and they gathered and then developed, they gathered and had discussions on what are the emerging issues in indigenous youth, young communities in their respective regions, and then they like developed statements voicing concerns of the youth. So since then, like every year, bigger and bigger populations of indigenous youths attended, participated, and voiced out the issues of indigenous youths. And the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus was formally inaugurated in 2006, and that was when the indigenous, not only the indigenous youths who participated in the permanent forum, but also youths from other regions try to contribute as much as they can in any means that is possible. And in 2008, it was recognized as a working caucus, which means we were formally given like space for reading out statements, and we were recognized more as a body by the UN, which gave us more opportunities to meet with different stakeholders during the meeting. Oh, sorry. So what do we do as GIYC? So overall, we do the awareness raising, advocacy, and capacity building. And awareness raising, what we mean by awareness raising is usually the youths, the issues of the youths have been discussed for like several decades already, but where the issues of indigenous youths were usually left out. So what the GIYC does is discuss the various issues and concerns that are specific to indigenous youths, and then voiced the concerns and issues at the UN Permanent Forum. So increasingly, our awareness raising activities and our actions are not limited to the UN Permanent Forum, but it goes, we go more and more to communicate more and more to different UN agencies and other stakeholders, because these are the people who are really working at the country level, and country level is the space where we have the biggest obstacles, and we have the biggest challenges, because most countries have very oppressive and discriminative laws and policies at the country level. So awareness raising, it goes to different stakeholders and UN agencies. And advocacy, it's mainly on the implementation of UNDRIP, and like I mentioned, alongside awareness raising, we do the advocacy regarding the issues that affect the situations of indigenous youths and children. And the other thing is the capacity building. Capacity building is mainly the initiatives that we take for indigenous youths and children at the global, regional, and community levels. And sometimes it includes our own initiatives, but other times it's together with, as a result of the advocacy that we do, cooperating, working together with different UN agencies, and sometimes NGOs or local NGOs. So yeah, I would like to take you a tour over a few of the success, the achievements that we made as GIYC for the indigenous youths. So in 2017, we had this preparatory meeting for the UN Permanent Forum at the Food and Agriculture Organization's headquarters in Rome. And 3 days of the meeting resulted in the Rome Statement on the contribution of indigenous youth towards a world without hunger, which talks a lot about the role of indigenous youths and the recommendations on ways of collaborating together with indigenous youths in different communities, and between them and the different UN agencies and different stakeholders, especially working on food security. And that actually led towards different, how should I say, different platforms where indigenous youths come to engage in like giving us more and more space to engage and contribute. So as I mentioned, as a result of, from the recommendation in the Rome Statement, there was a collaboration developed between UNFAO and GIYC. The first one is conducting Global Indigenous Youth Forum every 2 years. And this is the photos of the last Global Forum on Indigenous Youths that we held last June. And it was a very timely contribution of indigenous youths, because at that time that was the preparation during the when the process of the UN Food System Summit 2021 was going on. So there were a number of contributions and inputs made by the indigenous youths, and hundreds of indigenous youths joined the forum. And this is the one that we conduct every 2 years jointly with FAO and the GIYC. And another achievement from that statement was we requested the UNFAO and other agencies to create this internship program or internship program and volunteer program for indigenous youth, so that indigenous youths can become a part of these agencies, and then to be able to learn the way these agencies work, different agencies work, and then to be able to contribute in the future as leaders of the movement, to be able to make more stronger contribution into the development. So so far we have globally 30 youths, indigenous youths, have finished their internship with the UNFAO, and it includes all the socio-cultural regions. But still, as the internship is a paid internship, but not fully paid, there are still a few struggles, but still that internship program is a very great one for indigenous youths. And apart from those kind of cooperation, we also have publications and researches that we conduct together with different UN agencies at different levels. Some at the regional level. When I say regional level, it's the 7 social cultural regions of indigenous peoples, and some at the country level, and some at the very local level. So this is Global Indigenous Youth Through Their Eyes is one of the collaborations that we make as Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. This one is in partnership with Columbia University, and this is a very great one, and I would really strongly recommend for you all to get access through Columbia University's website. This is available for anyone who would really like to understand indigenous youths in a deeper way. So what have we achieved? Indigenous peoples. So let's set aside indigenous youths. The acknowledgement and recognition of the issues that we face as indigenous peoples have been really, really low, and which is reflected a lot in the laws and policies developed, and also in the processes, different processes at the global level, whether it's at the regional level or country level. So it's the same for indigenous youths, and it's even more serious for indigenous youths because some, like I mentioned, most of the development related work, they usually go through all these formal settings and formal systems that exist in the countries, which are not really relevant or in line with the practices in the indigenous communities. So these different services and sometimes these researchers don't really, and these development agencies, they don't really reach to the indigenous communities who are mostly in the rural areas, in far away communities. So due to the efforts of Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, we are really seeing the increasing acknowledgement and recognition of the issues that we face in Indigenous communities, which is very strongly reflected in the way we are now invited, in the way that these different agencies are formulating their work. So we truly are seeing increasing acknowledgement and recognition of the issues. And the other one that we are seeing is the increasing space for the inclusion of Indigenous youths in different processes, whether it's at the global and regional level or it's at the, well, at the country level, it's still very limited. So it's mainly at the global level and regional level. So we have really increasing space for the inclusion. And throughout the years, like the past few years, looking back at the past, not many, but 4 or 5 years, there have been quite a big progress, we would say. For example, at the previous, at the past UN Food Systems Summit 2021 process, 3 of the Indigenous youths, including me, we were appointed, we were nominated as the food security champions. And I myself, I was appointed as the one of the vice chairs of the action track 4. So we are, and it's quite similar to the different processes, including the climate change processes, UNFCCC, and even before, it was really difficult when we talked about the Indigenous youths, our fellow youths from other communities and mainland communities, they would just say, what are you talking about? We are youths and we are the same in terms of age and in terms of challenges, because they were not able to understand the necessity, the requirement for Indigenous youths issues to be discussed, or Indigenous youth representation. But nowadays, more and more, even our fellow youths from other communities, they become aware of these.
Human.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Sorry. It's a very interesting presentation, but we're just running a bit.
Oh, right. So I have just one last slide. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
No worries. Yeah,
Thank you. So more and more, how should I say, aware of the different situations and the additional challenges that we face as Indigenous youths. So the other progress is increased funding allocation for Indigenous youths in different processes and different programs. And now universities are also more open in other climate change related, traditional knowledge related spaces. They are more open to the Indigenous youths. So what challenges do we still have? The first one is discriminative policies and laws against Indigenous peoples at the country level. In many countries, they still exist there, and it's really this adds more and more challenges for Indigenous communities. And the other one is at the national level and local level, the limitation of space for inclusion of Indigenous youths. And the other one is, even though funding is increasing, we still have so much constraint for participation in different processes, and which usually hold us back in terms of our contribution into the solutions. And the other one is development gap between rural and urban areas, which still leave many Indigenous areas without electricity and telecommunications, again, which leave the Indigenous youths and young children to be able to participate and contribute into the ongoing processes at the country level and at the global level. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Phoolman, for your presentation. It's so very interesting, and I apologize for cutting you short in there. But it's very interesting on how, and really invigorating as well, on how Indigenous youth is now, you know, like forwarding and advancing Indigenous the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. And I think it's very important on celebrating the especially in the international level, the kind of activism as well, where they are being recognized by the UN and other international organizations. So thank you for your presentation, and thank you for giving us the information about the Global Youth Caucus. Thank you. Now we're moving on to our last speaker for the day, and he is Gladson Dungdung. He is a human rights defender, researcher, and writer based in Ranchi, India. He is the General Secretary of the Jharkhand Human Rights Movement and has undertaken fact-finding missions of hundreds of cases of police atrocities and human rights abuses. He has trained professionals on upholding and respecting human rights, including police officers, lawyers, journalists, social activists, and many others. He has written extensively on issues such as displacement of Indigenous peoples, forest rights of Indigenous peoples, impact of mining leases, and land acquisition on the local populations, and also on the actions of security forces in anti-Naxal operations. He has also advocated for the concept of Advocacy, which he believes focuses on the balance of living with nature and being at peace with prosperity. So I'm handing over to Gladson Dungdung, and welcome to the conference.
Thank you so much. Johar to all of you. And I would especially thank the organizer who have given me such a great opportunity to present about my experience. So basically, I would start talking about Indigenous people in India, and then come to the special case so that you will understand how we are addressing the issues of human rights, especially of Indigenous people, the Adivasis. There are 700 ethnic groups in India, Adivasi ethnic groups in India, which consist of 8.6% of total population, which is actually 104 million people. Indian state has not yet recognized, or I can say Indian government is not ready to recognize Adivasis as Indigenous people. Their stand is very clear that they say that everybody who lives in India is indigenous, but that is rubbish. So we have some special provisions in the Indian Constitution for protection of Adivasis, that is 5th and 6th schedule, and also there are several safeguarding laws. But despite that, there is a huge violation by the state of our civil and political rights, and also social, economic, and cultural rights. So presently, there is a tremendous pressure on our land, territory, and resources. So I would especially speak about one case, because I think all of you must be aware that how government of India had started a special military operation in 2009 against the indigenous people, just alleging that extremism has grown. In 2009, Prime Minister of India declared in the parliament that extremism is the biggest internal security threat and also threat to the investment climate. So with this word, we clearly understand what is the situation. So more than 200,000 military, paramilitary forces were deployed in 9 states of India, including my state, that is state of Jharkhand. And I am talking about especially my state, there is a forest called Saranda forest. Saranda is the largest salt forest in Asia, which is located in the West Simbung district of my state. The forest cover 860 square kilometer, which contain 25% iron ore of the country. We must remember this. However, this forest zone, became as a liberated zone of the CPI Maoist, that is Naxal group. However, in this area, another thing I would just bring into the notice that government was not able to do any activity. This is what government of India claims. But at the same time, these mining companies were operating mining projects in 50 different places. So in 2011, they did huge military operation. The operation called one is called Operation Braver Boy, another was Operation Monsoon, and another third one Operation Anaconda in this forest. So after that operation, what happened? Security forces, paramilitary forces, and also local police, they forced the indigenous people of 35 villages to leave the villages. They, captured the entire villages. They burned down 3 houses. 3 ration shops inside the forest were demolished totally. Food grains, utensils were destroyed in each and every houses. 3 villagers were killed, alleging that they were the member of the Communist Party of, Maoist, CPI Maoist. 2 women were raped. 500 villagers were tortured. Some of them were, hang ups to down. And then 112 villagers were detained and 33 were imprisoned. Schools, primary schools, there were many schools. All the schools were converted into police camps, and study material were destroyed. I have recorded for everything. Our team went inside and recorded everything. On the basis of that, I'm speaking. Ration cards, land intelligence paper, identity cards, everything was snatched away and burned down. Why it was burned down? So that villagers, Adivasis, indigenous people would have no paper to show them that they are member of so and so village. So that government would able to capture the entire forest region and hand over to the mining company. 50 iron ore leases had already been in the operation, covering area of 40,410 hectares. This area, mining is taking place in this area since 1925. But there was no road connectivity, there were no basic health services, no education facility, only few, what I said, schools. Those primary schools were, but no proper education was provided those days. Drinking water was not there, just people were taking water from this, ponds and other like river. Electricity was not in the region at all. So mining companies, though they were operating there for such a long time, but they had no interest in providing any facility to the villagers under their CSR programs. There was also, rampant illegal mining. According to the ministry report, we found that 953 cases of illegal mining was happening there in the forest. And the mining company, basically what they are doing, they are taking mining more than what they were, approved for mining. And then this mining company had a huge nexus with the CPM Maoist. So we found on record that they were paying huge levies to the Maoist company, and they were not just paying levies to the Maoist company, but they were also providing food, also providing other supplies to them. And then we also found that government had sanctioned 22 new mining leases covering the area of 9,337 area. So the entire idea was to throw the indigenous people out of the forest, and they should hand over all these 22 mining companies to the entire area. And these mining companies include Tata, Jindal, Mittal, all those big iron ore mining companies. So these mining companies, they were throwing mining dust into the river. So a river was entirely, full of iron or red water, and women were suffering. 75% of women were anemic. 80% children were malnourished. So whole those problem. There were also different, problem. In one village particularly, I would quote this because this is a special village which we found inside the forest, where 100 acres of fertile land was, converted into barren land because mining company was throwing dust. But when indigenous people demanded for compensation, the company said, we have not acquired your land, just this mining dust is going down during the rainy season, so we have nothing to do. And when they protested regularly, so the company filed cases against 6 villagers, and they were sent to prison for 13 days. So villagers had lost everything. Then what we did in this situation, the Jharkhand Human Rights Movement, we had a team. We constituted a team of fact-finding. We went inside the forest. We did the fact-finding. After that, we filed several complaints to the National Human Rights Commission and National Commission for Scheduled Tribe. We had also written series of letters to the Prime Minister of India, President of India, other union minister, and various government authorities. Then we had a huge press conference, series of press conference in the capital city of Jharkhand, and we took many victims, which, as I said, that 3 people were killed, brutally killed, alleging that they were Maoists. But when we found they were innocent, we took the family members of those deceased, and then we had we exposed in the media. At the same time, we also raised this issue with the National Human Rights Commission in a conference. I told them that if you are really concerned about human rights violation, you should send a team of investigation team to the surrender forest. So the National Human Rights Commission, they sent a team of 5 members, and I had taken them to the forest for a week. We were there, and entire area we visited and talked to the people. They also collected, facts, and also talked to the people. We also had a protest in Ranchi, one huge sit on protest to pressurize the government so that they do the investigation. Then also we filed a case in the Jharkhand Human Rights, Jharkhand High Court, asking them to intervene immediately. Then we also met a couple of members of Jharkhand Legislative Assembly. We requested them. As a result, they raised this question in the Assembly. By the time Assembly was on, so it was very good for us. So immediately government was forced to order for the investigation. And then at the same time, we also wrote several letters. As I said, personally, I write a letter to the union minister, whom I knew. And then I had series of meetings, at least 5 meetings I had with him. So these issues were raised, and I also raised the issue of development, that there is no electricity, no roads, no drinking water, despite mining companies are operating since 1925. So this issue was seriously raised by him. As a result, what was the result? As I already said, a team of investigation from the National Human Rights Commission visited. They found that what claim I had made, those were true. So they immediately ordered the state government to provide food, grain, etc., because the security forces, they had destroyed. So villagers had nothing to eat. So for 3 months, immediately they provided the food, grain, and then drinking water facilities, and then also compensation to the victim. Then National Commission for Scheduled Tribe also ordered the government to find out how many villagers which are not named or not recorded as a village. So they also started the process. At the same time, the government started the surrender development plan. First time it was happening. So under the surrender development plan, 56 villages were taken under plan, and they spent 41.7 million rupees. And then because of this plan, now you will find that there is a road inside the forest. There are electricity. They also provided electricity, and then mining company were asked to contribute for the Sarana development plan under their CSR plan. And then 7,000 families were provided like solar lamp and then bicycle and many other things. Villagers also, 10 villages were provided community rights under the Forest Rights Act. 665 individuals were provided forest rights under the Forest Rights Act. This is old record. Now they have provided more than that, but I'm talking about old record. 130 kilometers concrete road was constructed connecting all 56 villages. 118 hand pumps were installed for drinking water. 6 mobile health unit and the electricity were provided. School were restored and midday meal was also provided to the children. And then one widow of Mangal Honanga, who was killed by the security forces, she was given government job and she was also provided compensation of 200,000, but that is very less. And then action was also taken against the CRPF commandant who was actually who had killed, who had fired. But these were the achievement. But at the same time, I also had to face a huge problem because the Jharkhand police declared Jharkhand human rights movement as an open forum of the CPI Maoist Naxal organizations. And then I was openly said, you are advocating on behalf of them, you are overground Maoist and so on. On those days, my IB investigation was done against me. So many things happened. So, but despite that, I continued, did the intervention. And recently also, I must highlight one case because you might know about this. What's happening presently in my state? Not just my state, but every state which has indigenous populations. So now there is a huge pressure, as I already said, on our land, territory, on resources. In my state, government has been regularly, changing, amending the safeguarding laws which protect our land, especially the land of indigenous people. Like non-indigenous people, non-Adivasis cannot buy our land. But they were forcing. Last time they attempted to amend the act. We protested against that. And the 2 cases were filed against me. I'm, facing, and 2016, because of which my intervention in Saranda, I was offloaded when I was going to London from the Delhi airport, And now what's happening, because of this series of events, like the amending several land laws, and also, they are having a global investor summit. They are they form the land bank. So there is a huge pressure in the indigenous people. So in one case, for example, there are 3 districts like this Munda region. The popular movement which is still going on is called the Pathalgadi movement. In this area, what happened? Adivasis, they were afraid of all this global investor and all. They thought that now government wants to take our land, territory, and resources. They want to capture anyway. So they declared that we will not allow anybody, any outsider, to enter into our village unless they take permission from us. I also visited. I was invited in 13 villages to inaugurate this Pathalgadi movement. What happened? Because of this huge movement, in every village, around 200 villagers installed huge stone slab and declared that we will not allow any outsider without our permission to enter. Because of this movement, government declared indigenous people as an anti-state, unconstitutional. This movement was declared unconstitutional and crushed down. And finally, cases were filed against more than 11,000 people. 30 cases were filed in 3 districts. Out of 30, 23 are related to sedition charges. Sedition means you are involved in anti-national activity. So you should be imprisoned for whole life. That is the situation. In this case, 11,000 people are declared, as anti-national. Sedition charges were filed, and many were arrested. 115 people were sent to the prison. But because of pressure, government change, we regularly advocated. So now the new government declared 2 years back that government will withdraw all the cases. But despite this declaration, nothing is being done yet. Just they had constituted 3 committees, and then 3 committees, 2 committees did little bit work. 1 committee recommended to withdraw few cases, but they are not ready to withdraw all the cases despite declaration of the government. So now we are trying to put pressure on the government, because in this Pathalgadi movement case, also activists were charged. They were also some writers, some journalists, especially indigenous journalists. They were also framed as anti-national. So this is what happening at the moment. There are, as per allocated time, I could say that time is already over. So I would not go inside. What I want to say is that at present, final conclusion, I would say that there is a huge pressure, tremendous pressure on our land, territory, and resources, and the indigenous people or indigenous activists all are under the threat. So they are targeting, and the present government is even going, more ruthlessly than earlier government. During this pandemic also, they sanctioned 41 coal blocks to the private companies. There are a number of issues of indigenous people facing, like migration, trafficking, illegal land alienation. But with 20 minutes allocated time, I cannot speak about all those things. But I tried to put one frame so that you will understand that what is happening in the ground and how indigenous people, indigenous activists are dealing with the situation. So thank you very much for giving such a great opportunity.
Thank you so much for that lesson, and thank you for that presentation, and kind of like how it was, this is quite like, kind of like harrowing on how much, problems indigenous peoples have, especially with, clashes with the state, and how harrowing it is, the punishments, and, the really punitive actions. So thank you for shedding light on that, and that's like kind of a reality that we all kind of needed as well. So we are now moving to our joint Q&A session. So I would like all of our speakers to have their videos on, and so that we'll be able to facilitate this. As usual, we will try to go through as much questions as possible, but we do apologize if we haven't addressed your questions due to like time constraints. So yep. So we'll have some questions specific for our speakers, and there will also some that is just for general. So I'm just gonna do a little spotlight on everyone in here, right? So I'm guessing we'll go through for specific speakers first, and there is one here for Phoolman Chaudhary here. The question is there pressure on the government of Nepal to push specific public policies that would help protect indigenous peoples within their national action plan on business and human rights?
Yeah, thank you, Desina. Actually, a very serious and very important question regarding this matter, because of course, Nepal government has ratified the ILO Convention 169 in 2007, but still government has not any concrete action plan to respect the ILO Convention 169. So we have already recommended, we have special official recommendation to the Nepal government that we draw the attention in 2018 during the annual session in New York. I officially draw attention to the Nepal government. The Nepal government should have and must make the national action plan to respect the ILO Convention 169. And also, as a member of the PAN Forum, I would like to draw attention to the Asian country, the country who did not ratify the ILO Convention 169. We urge Asian state to consider ratify the convention as per the recommendation made by the treaty bodies and in the Universal Periodic Review. Because this is our official recommendation, we already circulated to the member state. On the other hand, we have also UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, and I also urge to the member state, the members should be implemented the UN DRIP to respect the Indigenous people's fundamental human rights. This is my concern. Thank you. I think I reflect the, I respond the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so we're moving up to a question for Phoolman. And the question is, how has Myanmar's military coup impacted on indigenous peoples and NGOs and activities advocating for indigenous rights?
Right. Thank you for the question. So yeah, the coup has really a very disastrous impact on the whole country, mainly to indigenous communities, because indigenous communities are the ones who really stood up and still who are standing up for or against the coup and who are standing up for democracy. So if we look back to 2021, it was first in April that the biggest crackdown by the military happened, and that was in one of the indigenous communities in Dumoso Township in Karenni State. And that was followed by an attack, a huge attack in an indigenous community in Chin State. And actually, indigenous communities have never really stopped receiving these big attacks for the past 6 to 7 decades. But after the coup, this has really worsened. And we have to say that at least alone in Karenni State, it created more than 1.5 lakh of people being displaced, internally displaced, and all of these are indigenous peoples. And in Chin State, where I stay, it's more than 60,000 internally displaced people. That's the same in Kachin State and Shan State and Karen State. So airstrikes have been dozens of airstrikes have been conducted by the military in indigenous communities. So it's been like we have been saying that, okay, we are truly facing the Tutsi, the coup and the conflict and COVID. So the struggles are doubled. And in around July last year, July, August, September, hundreds of indigenous no, not hundreds. In total, it would be thousands of indigenous persons died from COVID. basically not because it was very severe one, but because the basic healthcare system is broken already. And at that time, there were no I mean, most of you might have seen the photos of the people, like hundreds of people queuing to get this oxygen concentration service. And all these has led, all these gaps and obstacles have caused the indigenous people's struggles double. I would say that most of the basic education system is broken, and the healthcare system is broken. But now, in most indigenous communities, self-rule has been introduced, and for both healthcare and education systems, services, indigenous leaders and these revolution leaders are introducing these services little by little. So we're still in a period of trying so hard to bring to gather ourselves again together so that these services are not missed. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Yumon. It's very interesting. And then for Mr. Gladson Dugdong, the question is, in this scenario, how do you see indigenous people's rights versus development needs of the country in form of coal and other resources? Should the government deal with this issue?
See, I think I have very different take on this, because this so-called so-called development, and which is actually driven by the corporate development model and indigenous people. They two cannot go together. Either you have to surrender one or two, because what's happening what's happening globally? See, this global climate crisis is actually a result of this corporate development model. So if Earth has to survive, if indigenous people and the entire living being has to survive, then you have to rethink on the development model, because this, you cannot go on and on. Because see, ICPP, what ICPP is saying, IPCC, like IPCC on climate change, it has already said we have only 1 decade to protect this Earth, protect this universe. So despite that, our global leaders are not doing anything. Do you see any action in the UN? Not at all. Just people going into the UN conferences and talking. Talking will not, serve the purposes. It is just our Mother Earth has been destroyed. It is plundered in the name of growth and development, and then our global leaders going just talking. You have to find out the way. Today is the only way to survive the living beings and also the earth, that is indigenous way of life. If people are not ready to adopt it, and just they will talk about development. At the end, we are writing, the history of our own extinction. We must keep this in our mind.
Of course, thank you for that, Gladson. We're now moving into the general questions, so I'm going to open the floor to everyone in here. I think this question really is like quite kind of contemporary as well. So the question is, internationally, COVID-19 has had disastrous impacts on indigenous peoples, but in your countries, what are the steps that have been taken to protect them, especially with the impact of COVID-19 on the general population as well? Thank you. So maybe we could start with Phoolman, and then with Yumon, and then with Gladson.
Very interesting question, John. Of course, if you talk about the impact of the COVID-19, we get the such scenario, such situation. The indigenous people are most vulnerable from the COVID-19. So because why the indigenous people are affected by the COVID-19 mostly because the indigenous people have daily life is directly connected with the nature, like forests, water, natural resources, and so many other natural resources. So if you disconnect to indigenous people from the nature, and their life will be goes down and down. And if you see the impact in between COVID-19 and indigenous people's lifestyle, it's really important and really interconnected. So we always highlight and raise the voice of the indigenous peoples. If we protect, if we preserve the nature and is related with the indigenous people. So these two things is should be addressed parallelly, not separately. So at first we have to protect nature, and we can survive, we can ensure the rights of indigenous people by protecting the nature. So this is related with the nature that I already mentioned about the COVID-19's impact. So I would say if we protect the nature, we preserve the nature, we can protect the indigenous people's life. So this is my response from my side. Thank you, John.
Yes. Yeah, COVID-19 was it also had a very, and it still have a very big impact on the, in indigenous communities too. But what we realized in indigenous communities during the COVID-19 was that our managing, our way of managing resources and our traditional knowledge are of really great asset during the COVID-19 period. Firstly, because of the recipes that we usually use in our indigenous food and indigenous medicines, they are of really great help during this period, because most of these imported medicines do not easily reach to indigenous communities anymore because of the transportation block and the lockdown that were imposed frequently during since the first wave of the COVID. So the indigenous recipes, indigenous youths have grown a lot of interest in the indigenous recipes, and also our forests are usually usual supermarkets. We never used to need supermarkets, but as all of you are aware, the so-called development and this capitalism really introduced this market sort of supermarket into our communities. But during the COVID-19, the silver lining for us was the revitalization of indigenous recipes and indigenous traditional knowledge on food and medicine that were very much I truly appreciate also as an indigenous youth and community leader. That was one thing. And the other thing was our way of food security. So how we do the traditional farming, which used to be very much blamed by other communities, the governments and some UN agencies and INGOs, they used to blame our shifting cultivation or rotational farming a lot in the past. But during COVID, when rice were not able to be transported into our communities, that's when we realized, and many communities realized, that, oh, our way of farming is the best source of food security for us. And there are communities like semi-modernized communities who don't really practice this traditional farming anymore. And there are communities who are still practicing this traditional farming heavily. Then during the COVID-19 period, it was the communities that still practice traditional farming that were secured in terms of food security. And so basically, those who still have food sovereignty, they have food security. We have food security. So this has also like introduced a lot of questions and food for thought for not only for indigenous communities, but also for the government and authorities to really reconsider what kind of agriculture or farming system and food transport system that we use. So of course, we do use this traditional recipes and traditional medicine in the cases where these Western medicines are not really available, and these communities are much healthier. And we have already been self-isolated in our way of living. It really is a very healthy one since long ago. This is also like the highlight. This has also become the highlight for the COVID-19 period. And the ones most impacted were like I mentioned, semi-modernized and semi-urban areas compared to these rural and isolated and faraway communities where most indigenous peoples reside. Yeah, thank you.
As far as indigenous peoples are concerned, there are a different kind of impact. The indigenous people who are living in the forest areas, they had very less direct impact as far as COVID is concerned. But those who have shifted to the cities, many of them lost life because they have changed their food eating pattern, and also medicines. They are fully depend on the so-called modern medicines. But the villagers, who also had a huge impact differently. For example, who collect forest produce, because India was shut down for such a long time. So there was no market available, so that they were not able to sell forest produce. And many people who have, for example, very less area of cultivated land, so they collect forest produce. At the same time, they also go for daily wages. So they were not able to go for daily wages because everything was closed for during first COVID. It was closed down for 9 months, and then second time also 3 months, and in various ways. And then that was the impact. And then also because of this COVID, people, especially who are jailed, what I said about 10,000 people who are charged with citizens, courts were not open, so they were not able to bail out their people. So they were inside, and I talked to the many people, visited villages. They were saying that they had to sell their land, they had to sell their trees, etc., so that they would survive, and also pay the loan which they have taken to fight the cases. And then a big impact is because of the government action. Though government declared that nothing should be taken, no protests, everything is closed down, and government should not take any action against people. But in reality, there are many cases in state of Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh. Everywhere you will find that forest department, especially forest guard, were sent to the villagers. So many villages were, vacated, saying that they are occupying the forest region illegally. Though under the Forest Rights Act, they are supposed to be the given, rights of the habitation rights and also the forest right. But it didn't happen. But they were forcefully evicted. And then also now what's happening, like there is forcefully, vaccination process is going on. In many cases, those people, those indigenous people who are afraid of this so-called modern marriage, because many people lost life in India because of this vaccination process also. So they are obviously afraid. So now they have deployed a police and force. So they are catching indigenous peoples and forcefully injecting them. Though the Supreme Court said nobody should be, forcefully injected, but they are vaccinating forcefully. And then they have also stopped ration supply. They are saying those who will not been vaccinated, they are not ready to take vaccine, they will be not given ration. Those kind of things is still going on. So this is what the impact I would say.
Thank you all for your answers. And I think it's interesting that it kind of like connects to Phoolman's kind of note about trying not to disconnect people from nature as well. As they say, living in the forest, there definitely less direct impact from all this kind of COVID-19, and I'm pretty sure all other diseases. And it's nice to hear as well that some indigenous like practices kind of surfaces as well with when Phoolman said indigenous foods and medicines and recipes are now being surfaced because of this. The next question, I think this like more kind of a bit personal, but I think it's very interesting to see what you think when working in this field as well, especially when many of us are going to be human rights defenders and we like to see like a first-hand kind of like experience. So the question is, how do you maintain your motivation as a human rights defender or advocate? Is working in this field can become emotional and sometimes have mental effects on everyone involved. If you had any advice for upcoming human rights advocates, defenders, what advice would you give? So again, we're going to start with Phoolman and then Phoolman and then Gladstone. And yeah, can you hear me? Okay. So the question is, where's the question again? It's about, okay, how do you maintain your motivation as a human rights defender or advocate? Working in this field can become emotional and sometimes have mental effects on everyone involved. If you have any advice for any upcoming human rights advocates and advocates and defenders, what advice would you give?
If Sir Phoolman isn't ready, I can go first.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is quite personal. Yeah, and I think very important. So as a human rights defender, I myself has been in this work for about a decade. So there are times that I would really like to give up. Give up meaning like leaving this work, because sometimes, especially like on a daily basis, you deal with these human rights violations in different communities, and you try to raise these issues to different mechanisms, and you try to help, but sometimes things are not that fast, especially when it comes to human rights advocacy and like taking action against these perpetrators, especially when the perpetrators themselves are state or big businesses, people who are too giant for you to fight against. So there were times when I thought that oh, I think this is enough for me, and like not much really progress or things, thoughts like that. But, you know, it's at such times, it's really important, I think, to see, to look at the less privileged people than yourself, than myself. And okay, if I really stop doing this, what about those people who are really suffering, and those people who are really care about and on a daily basis who are really going through these human rights violations? So it's really good to be very ambitious in terms of human rights situation, but at the same time, if we really look always at the reality and to connect, and also it's very helpful to compare between like 2 years ago when we started and now, what's the difference, and is there any progress? So it's really helpful to compare the previous situation and the current situation that has progressed because of the actions that we've taken, whether like individually or collectively or jointly with other organizations. Or so yeah, that is one thing. And the other thing is, like I mentioned, it's really helpful to look at those who are really willing to contribute but not are able to. Because for myself, I speak English and I have good connection networks. And so what are the, where do I use all these privileges for? To, if not, if I don't use these to help my community or the people who are less privileged. And I myself, my dad is a non-Indigenous person, so I speak the national language more fluently than those people in my community, Indigenous communities. So where do I use this privilege of being a fluent speaker and who can write and communicate well in the national language? And it's the same for these UN mechanisms and when it comes to international advocacy. So these are really, I think it's very much helpful when you look back to these less privileged people than yourself, and then to remind yourself why do we exist in this world, and from which part do we want to contribute. But advocacy is not an easy thing, and it takes time. So it takes patience, perseverance, but all the great things are never easy. So, I mean, it's again to, but sometimes it's, I think at the same time, it's very important to have a self-care, to heal yourself when things are too harsh for you also, because we ourselves are people, so human beings. So sometimes we need a break, sometimes we need to heal ourselves, and sometimes we need mentors are really helpful for me. In my case, I have like mentors who are really guiding me at times of really difficulty. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we'll move on to Phoolman or Gladson.
Yeah, maybe I think I don't see Phoolman speaking. See, I think what I have learned through all these decades, at least for the last 1.5 decades, I've been doing this work. See, first, what I have learned that we must, focus on the fact. Whatever we listen, we should check the fact, because many times I realize even victims, sometimes they will tell you something else, but reality is something else. Because in India especially, there are also several different, vested interest groups. So when they see you as a human rights activist, they will call you, police has done this and that with us. But in reality, the case was something else. I have seen many cases like that also. So we must control our emotions and find the facts. And now we must be, anybody who wants to be human rights activist must be neutral. Because now people are taking position. I have seen in India, like many groups, there are also several groups who are actually associated some or other way with the ultras also, with the Maoist and other group. So what I have seen, when security forces are killing this ultras, Naxal, actually Naxal, they go and do the fact finding. But when innocent people are being killed, they will not go and do the fact finding. So we must be neutral. And when person like me, I have raised both issues. When Naxal have killed the indigenous people, then also I have raised the question. When a state has killed, then also I have raised. And when in 2011, first Jharkhand Human Rights Report I released. That time I had one chapter about Maoist, non-state actors' violence, human rights violation. So they were telling, they called me, they said, you should not have published this against us. You are going against us. So in this case here, people like me have threat from both sides, state as well as non-state actors like Maoist and other who do the human rights violations. So when we do activism, it is like being a human rights defender is like putting your finger in an electric socket, So you have to be ready, because when you are dealing with the human rights issues, state will be behind. State will go against you. So you have to face the cases. Sometimes maybe even you will be targeted. Police directly, many times they will beat. I have beaten a couple of times. Even I was taken to the police station. I was, filed, charged with false cases. And then second thing, obviously, what a state will do is try to find out your economic sources. So they will block your economic sources, because they know if they block your economic sources, you would not be able to do anything. In India, now almost NGOs have been shut down. FCRA has been changed. So now even foreign organization, you can directly have fund from foreign abroad. But for example, international organization who have branch in India, they cannot share their FC money with any NGOs in India. So they knew that all the NGOs there, some or other way, some of them are doing good work. There are also cases of mismanagement of money and other things. But finally, they will block economic sources. And so there are many challenges now in India, especially. There is a huge challenge that there is no space for decent voice. So they are not ready to listen to you at all. Whatever they claim, so you have to go according to them. Otherwise, you are an anti-state. Even now, they are saying that opposition parties are anti-state. So in this situation, it is really big trouble for activists like us to survive. So now many indigenous activists, they are aligning themselves with the political parties so that at least they have some or other way a political safeguard. So this is another study. So you have to think differently how to survive in this situation. Yeah.
And then we have a final word for Phoolman regarding this question. Apologies, we were running out of time, but yeah.
Can you explain the question once again?
The question is, how do you maintain the motivation as a human rights defender and advocate? So how do you actually maintain kind of your morale, facing challenges? How do you, it's because sometimes it can be crucial, mentally draining. So what kind of motivates you into doing this type of work?
Oh, very interesting question. Oh, of course, I would say if you have a clear vision, if you have a proper action plan, if you have, if you are passionate with the issues or problem, whatever is there. And one thing is that in particular place and particular issues, there are different types of solution and way to how to resolve that one. So myself, I would say, if I'm committed with the issues, certainly we can do something different for the entire group. If you don't have a proper action plan and vision and objective, you cannot get any achievement. So I always say, if we think together, if we do together, if we work together, and we can certainly achieve our commitments and mission. A tool that we should do for your kind information. Of course, due to the COVID-19 over the 2 years, we cannot, we are not able to conduct any kinds of meeting, conference in person. So myself, where I'm affiliating, like a AIIN forum, so we didn't have any in-person meeting and conference. And so last time we conducted the annual session virtually, only in person, member state and member of the AIIN forum. So this year, we are also going to conduct the annual session virtually, but in person for member state and the AIIN forum. So I would like to encourage all of you, if you join in our annual session virtually, you are most welcome, because this year we have very special theme. The theme is Indigenous Peoples, business autonomy and human rights principle of due diligence, including free, prior, informed consent. So really specific theme for this year. So I strongly encourage all of you to join in our annual session. It will be take place 19 April to 6th May 2022. So you all are welcome for this event. And I would like to thank once again all of you for joining the wonderful event. And I look forward to hear your close cooperation in future. I wish successful and productive dialogue. Thank you, John. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Phoolman. Unfortunately, that is it for our Q&A session. I again apologize, we did not go through all of the questions. We're just running a bit out of time, I'm afraid. And then it's off to Dr. Carlos Guido Gramenga. Please, apologies for the mispronunciation. And then we're going to have his closing remarks for the conference. And he is a lecturer here at the University of Essex and is the Deputy Director of the Center for Migration Studies. And his teaching and research focuses on Indigenous rights as well. So welcome to the conference and thank you for your participation.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much to Phoolman, Mai, and Gladstone, because it has been very, very illuminating, your participation, your contribution, not only in terms of an explanation of what you do, but also in terms of the personal involvement of yourselves when you are explaining this. And I think this is really very important. The personal touch is something that I have always admired when I work with Indigenous activists anywhere. So I'm going to fulfill what Jan wanted, and I'm going to finish my remarks in 5 minutes. And if I don't finish my conclusive remarks in 5 minutes, you can sue me. Let me start with this. I think it's very, very important to have the eye on the ball. And I think the three speakers clearly highlighted that. And what is that? The only way you can really understand the issues facing Indigenous people is to describe the threats they experience on a daily basis. Everything else follows from that. And why is it that they're failing threats, they're experiencing threats to their communities and to even to their lives on a daily basis? For one simple reason, because the drive of dispossession of the traditional territories, lands, and resources has not faded away. This has been an ongoing threat always from the past to the present, since colonizers arrived first and then nation states evolved. This threat is ongoing. And it is from that threat that patterns of violence, repression, and dispossession emerge. And why is it so important this? Because you don't understand Indigenous communities without understanding their deep connections to the lands and territories where they live. This is part of their history, it's part of their identities, it's part of their cultures. So when processes of land dispossession start to appear, this automatically translates into threats to cultural dispossession. And cultural identity issues become really, really important. So basically, Indigenous people is a tale of survival. in relation to this. And the threats are ongoing. They happened this morning, they keep happening, they will happen tomorrow. So it is in this context when you have to acknowledge the history of resistance and mobilization, very active and very creative, that indigenous people have been able to develop, facing immense threats, overpowering forces that come from colonial masters, that come from nation states, global corporations, and so on and so forth. And in that context, I think it's really interesting what the three of you have highlighted about the relationship of indigenous people with the international system, in particular the United Nations. And how do we explain that? I think this was a very incredible creative story of resistance and creativity, because indigenous people realized that one way of facing the main adversary, who is the main adversary? The nation state. The only way you can face the adversary is to get involved in the international system as a way of putting pressure on nation states. But it wasn't only about going and claiming something. It's more than that. It was about participating actively and creating a space for themselves. So in 2000, with the creation of the Permanent Forum, that was a big milestone. It is the voice of indigenous people going at the heart of the United Nations system. This leads to the 2007 Declaration of Indigenous People Rights. And this is an extraordinary achievement, really. And since then, as Mike clearly highlighted and Phoolman also described, because they participate in this system, it has been, indigenous people not only have been active contributors to the understanding and expansion of rights within the United Nations system, but it's very important also to acknowledge how they've been able to contribute to other forums in the United Nations that are not indigenous. And I think that is also shows the capacity of capacity building, creativity, resilience, the desire to share knowledge and share practices. They go beyond the communities themselves. I think this is very, very, very beautiful in fact. And I think at the end of the day, Phoolman said something very interesting. One thing that indigenous people always try to achieve is to bridge the gap between recognition of indigenous rights and the implementation of indigenous rights. So if indigenous people have been very successful in the international system to achieve the recognition of indigenous rights, however, those indigenous rights have to be implemented within nation states. And nation states are the ones who are complicated in relation to that. And some nation states don't ratify or don't recognize some of the international treaties in relation to indigenous rights, and others who do, they don't implement them correctly or they just ignore them. And these are things that facing communities all the time. So I would like to finish with this. I think if we remember this existential threat to which indigenous people have to face every single day, to which each community has to deal with, where a number of negative consequences follow from that, it is highly remarkable and moving to see how indigenous people have been able to challenge that, been able to survive as peoples, and been able to influence and shape policies that refer to themselves. The fight is not over, because until nation states guarantee and protect their collective rights to their territories, lands, and resources, these threats are going to be an ongoing problem permanently. And I think this is a challenge. And this is why I'm so moved today to see Phoolman, Mike, and also Gladstone working alongside indigenous communities who don't give up, who keep working, keep thinking in a very positive way, in a very creative way. Ultimately, it's all about protecting the rights of peoples to be who they are without facing the threat of disappearing as people because they have been pushed away from whatever idea of development or expansion the nation state can come with. So I would like to thank you so much for this panel. I was really moved and very illuminated for what you guys said, and I hope I managed to say this in 5 minutes. Thank you so much, guys, and good luck with your work.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks. And I think that is it for our conference. We went a little bit over the 1 p.m. mark here in the UK, but thank you all for joining us, and a huge thank you again for all of our panelists and have shared your work and experiences. For the attendees, we will have our second event on the 19th of March 2022. So please do book your places to continue our discussion regarding Indigenous people's rights. The link is also on the chat, and as well as our social media platforms and further information about the Human Rights Conference So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.